Hello and welcome to another episode of Frame and Reference. I'm your host, Kenny McMillan, and today we've got Daniel Claridge and Martin Dicicco of Searchers, a recent documentary that was just shown at Sundance as part of our Sundance series of interviews. This is an interesting documentary because it's not necessarily, I wouldn't call it a traditional documentary. Essentially, you as the viewer are taken on a ride of multiple people going through people's dating profiles, online dating profiles. And it's fascinating. I mean, it just pulls you right in immediately. It's just a very interesting concept and interesting execution. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. So if you have the opportunity, please seek it out. It's a great film. And in this talk, we discuss the making of it. We talk about, the doing it the hard way, the Grumpy Man good old days and stuff like that. And it's just really fun, interesting conversation that I think you'll enjoy as much as I had having it. That's not good English. Anyway, like I always say, I like to keep these intros short. So without further ado, here is Daniel Claridge and Martin Dicicco. So thank you so much for doing Frame and Reference. I really appreciate it. I was able to watch the documentary last night, and I can't say I've seen something like this. Where did you come up with this concept? Because the whole film is very interlinked, like the editing, the audio, the graphic, like it's all kind of one cohesive image. So where did that come from?
We knew from the beginning that we wanted to use like the Interrotron thing. We wanted the direct eye line on the lens because we were making a film. We were exploring the idea of making a film about this intimate subject, which is like dating and specifically sort of online dating. Yeah. And so, so the final form it took really emerged out of a process of experimentation. So we had the essential elements. We knew we wanted what you're calling sort of the Errol Morris kind of Interrotron thing, but
I wouldn't dare keep using his name like that. We'll just call it your Interrotron.
Sure. Yeah. And, so we shot some sort of like some initial interviews, these kind of tableau interviews with, at that time, it was really about like older folk and how they navigated dating usually on Match.com. And then at some point in the process of experimenting, we landed upon the idea that kind of you see in the film, which is like these more close-up intimate shots of these people browsing their profiles on camera, staring into the lens. So it's to say that the inspiration was really, for us, I think, emerged out of a kind of playful mode of experimentation where we sort of came to this. Martin, I know you've sort of talked about this, but there's also like an element of taking note from the apps themselves, right? Which sort of present the dating apps themselves, which sort of present people in these boxes, right? To be swiped on left or right. And so there's a kind of unified look to the way that people appear on these apps that I think also informed the logic of the cinematography and the visuals.
Yeah, I mean, I came on a bit later than Daniel, but at that time there kind of already was, Pacho and you had already kind of figured out the basic template of how framing was going to be, and to me it was like immediately clear that these were frames that were exactly that they were reminiscent of of what the dating squares were like. So every person who's swiping, who's looking through, every searcher is actually, we're viewing them as a potential match as well as the audience. And so that was like really, when I remember Pacho showed me the first kind of like sample he had cut together with all this, and that's kind of the first thing that I saw. I was like, oh well, I'm also, they're searching for their match, but I'm also judging them as if they came up on my dating app as well.
Yeah, it's really I really loved the little intro where we don't have that overlay kind of sitting here. where it's just some dude staring into the camera going, nah, yeah, no, and you're like, what the fuck is, like, what what am I watching? And then it kind of like fades in and you're like, oh, and then that sets the tone so beautifully. How much, because there's, you know, it's relatively easy, I suppose, in my head to get the overlay there, but there's some really clever, like, if they move forward or back, like those focus racks that go in with the effects. How did you guys have a ton of interaction with the editor? Were you guys the editor? You know, what was that relationship like with the visual effects people, so to speak? Motion.
Well, I did the animations, the overlays as well. So it was this kind of intimate team, and that, you know, the benefit of that was we could be really specific about what we wanted to answer the specific question. A lot of those little tricks were sort of post interventions as it probably appeared.
Totally.
So we could sort of, we knew that if we had, you know, we knew that if we were animating the overlays separately from the, you know, the production footage itself, we could sort of DJ that a little bit. And so that was a balance that we arrived at. The editors were absolutely, Hannah Buck and Scott Cummings were absolutely instrumental in figuring out the right balance of that kind of stuff. Because there was always a concern, you know, it's always about like sort of reinforcing rather than getting in the way of like the heart of the film, which again was about this kind of naturalness and intimacy. And so there was a question early on, like, oh, is this, you know, is too many focus pulls a little gimmicky? You know, those were all questions that had to kind of shake out over the course of editing and screening it down a bunch of times.
Sure. Yeah, I the thought that kept coming to me, I don't think it was gimmicky at all. I think it was really really fun, and it also helped. For some reason, it really helped the doc go. Like I didn't feel like I was sitting there for 80 minutes. You know, like it just kept. I was kind of waiting to see if there was going to be a twist or something, and there wasn't, and I found that kind of beautiful. You know, that you're just there in the moment, and at one moment, I think it was the girls who were looking for, like, for lack of a better term, like sugar daddies, that I became uncomfortable. And then that was when I was like, oh, because I bet someone else made someone uncomfortable, or someone else, like you were saying, like you feel like you're on the other end of the thing, and you start, because they're looking right at you. You know, that's yeah, I don't know, it's just it affected me.
Yeah, I think it's like you're both like as Martin said, you're sort of complicit, but so you're sort of like judging them, but you're also like participating in the judgment. And I think for Pacho, like that idea of this like refraction, I think what Pacho calls like this kind of through the looking glass vibe was really important. The way that subject and audience is kind of intermingled in this shared window into these apps and into this process.
Well, and with him, they're also doing it. Mm-hmm. You know, having him in the back. Also, I loved, this is completely an aside right here, but just when the sound girl was behind one of the subjects and you gave her the little lower third anyway, let us know who she was.
Haley, yeah.
I thought that was funny.
Yeah. But Pacho, I forget, Pacho recently told me that he ripped that off of, who was it? Nick Broomfield. I think he had mentioned that he had ripped that off of Nick Broomfield putting the mixer
in the shot.
I mean, but it's a delightful thing, I think. I mean, yeah. They did it in Mandabala. Jason Cohn did, when putting the translator in the shot with the person that is being interviewed.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I have a. Sorry.
Free package.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say too, though, that like part of that gesture is also like Pacho is both, you know, Pacho's both the documentary filmmaker, but he's also a subject. And so I think what those kind of moves were designed to do was just to like reinforce this idea that to remind us that there's the documentary process that's happening, but also that Pacho's like more intimately involved in this whole search than a typical documentary filmmaker.
Well, and I think just the little touches like that keep it kind of light. You know, it is a fun documentary where I feel like if I were to have made it, it would have been kind of dark, you know, like, or negative for that matter. So how did you guys get involved with the documentary in the first place? Have you worked with Pacho?
Yeah.
Thank God. Before?
Martin, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm fairly new to New York, but I had known Pacho's work. I had seen it before, but I had met him through, I don't know, the kind of similar filmmakers that I had met here. We met through friends in the filmmaking community here in New York, and I think we had seen each other socially a couple of times, and then I don't know, maybe he had seen some of my work, and the more we saw each other, the more we talked about each other's works, and then it ended up being he was working on this and then called me for it.
Mm.
Yeah, and Pacho and I, like I've known Pacho for something like 10 years at this point. And so he was actually essentially like an adjunct professor when I was a student, a filmmaking student. And so he was sort of like an early mentor, and then we became sort of fast friends and eventually collaborators. So we've worked on a few shorts together on his previous feature, American Sector, which is about these fragments of the Berlin Wall that remain in the United States. I did some camera work, and yeah, I think it's just like we share a kind of sensibility, and we also get along, and that goes a long way in this world.
Totally. What got you guys into cinematography in the first place? Did you always know you were going to be documentary filmmakers, cinematographers, or was there like a shift for you, or what was that journey like? I hate the word journey. What was that? What was that like?
I would say that I used to live in LA, and I worked in film production for a very long time. Mostly, I kind of went the crew route. I was an AC, and then I got really kind of bored with ACing because it was the same job no matter what. Like what location you're in, what genre of film, what the script was the same job. And I got into doing lighting as a lighting technician, which I found to be more interesting. I quickly learned that like the AC, because of sole proximity next to the DP, who's usually operating camera, they always get to be so much closer to the cinematographer rather than what I chose to do, which is a lighting tech, which half the time I'm pre-rigging some other location.
Right.
But I really loved it, and I did that for for many years, and then I basically became eligible for 728, which is the local in LA for lighting technicians, and I kind of was like, man, I don't want to be pulling cable like when I'm much older, and so I felt like, well, I should be shooting. Why don't I just try that? And yeah, and I just started like saying yes to every single gig I could in the city. And in LA, there's a lot. There's a lot of crap too. And when you're starting out to shoot, you got to shoot all that crap. And I have a mixed video that I made, like it's a mixtape music video of all the bad music videos I worked on, which is quite entertaining. But yeah, I just like worked on a lot of music videos and shorts and narrative shorts. And then eventually, like, I worked on one documentary that took me like on a road trip around the country, this film called Soundtracker, made by a friend of mine, Nick Sherman. And it was like no lighting, no grip truck, none of that, just me and a camera and the director. And it was so much more freeing and so much more interesting to me to be on that road trip with the person we were filming with, that I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of, this is intriguing as a practice, and how do I like keep doing this type of thing? And so I kind of got into documentary that way. I didn't stop doing other sorts of cinematography, but I really kind of like dug my teeth into documentary after that film.
Sure. Daniel?
Yeah. And in some ways I don't think of myself like primarily as a cinematographer. You know, I'm a filmmaker a lot like Martin, and I I also am an editor and a director as well. And you know, for me, like there's sort of like two answers. One answer is like I think that I value sort of like the ability to make films sort of like independently, and so part of the ethos that was kind of instilled in me in film school, sort of studying like observational documentary with Pacho as well, was about sort of like being out there with the camera but also being the editor, and this kind of like vertically integrated process, so to speak. So I've just sort of learned the kind of from soup to nuts kind of the filmmaking process on this kind of small scale. But there's also something about like documentary cinematography, you know, like the process of like looking through the camera that I find to be really revealing. And you know, I've always been a photographer, you know, a hobby photographer, and you know, so I try to shoot as much as possible, and that's kind of how I've ended up working with Pacho over the course of the years.
You know, it's funny you say the like vertically integrated filmmaking, because I feel like you know, I'm probably a little bit younger than you guys. When I was in film school, it was before the 5D had come out, and then when I hit college, it was like right kind of in that first Red time. So it was still sort of like, we have a cinematographer, we have a director, and now it feels more like a lot of people, especially younger folks, you know, if you're on doing YouTube or any kind of like small independent productions, there is a lot more of that. Do you see that sort of person of many hats being a job going forward? Because I know it made it more difficult for me when I was getting started actually working to say like, oh yeah, I can edit, I'm a cinematographer, I can color, you know, whatever, hire me for anything. No one hired me for anything. But then the second I said I'm a cinematographer, the jobs started to come.
Yeah, it's interesting how both the 5D and the Red 1 kind of changed things. It's hard to talk about this without like sounding like you're whining or complaining or a Luddite sometimes.
No, I get it.
Like
we all have this conversation, I feel.
But look, I'll say this. This isn't a knock on like any position or anything. I think it's in terms of like when you're at a high skill level, it's a bit different now. I think it's easier to get a job. Let's say you're a camera assistant. I think it's much easier to become a camera assistant on a big job and be worse at your job than people were back in the day. And that's solely, I think, technical.
Yeah.
Because like when I was coming up and I like stopped wanting to be a camera assistant, there were people who I worked with that could take apart every 35 or 60 millimeter camera and rebuild it, like take it apart and rebuild it, right? Any kind of problem that ever happened, they knew how to fix it because they knew how to take apart the camera. But nowadays, if there's an electronics problem, first of all, you don't have time to pull out the soldering board and fix it while you're on set.
Sure.
And the thing is, you don't have the knowledge. Nobody really has the knowledge to fix that, like while you're on set. So I think that one thing that has changed in terms of getting a job, I don't know about getting a job. Let's keep that part out of it. But I definitely know that one thing that has changed is the technical ability of, let's say, a camera assistant and what you're expected to do as a high level, really good AC, I feel is a bit lower than it used to be when we were working with film.
I would have to agree. And I would say it's probably because when you had to do it, quote unquote, the hard way, there was the knowledge of how
No, go ahead.
each individual step was done for anything, but also there was a discipline to it. You know, the stakes were a lot higher if you could blow a film take, for instance. And so now, like, if you were, let's say, filming your own stuff and you decided you really like ACing, but you've been on autofocus this whole time, and now you're handed the little RE wheel and you're sitting there going, all right, let's get after it. And you don't have that muscle memory or anything like that. That institutional knowledge, I think, is perhaps harder to get to.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a difference of like people who came up being able to pull focus without a monitor and people who have only pulled focus on a monitor. Then there's the people that have only been able to pull focus since Cinetape was invented, and then those who have the steel tape and take measurements after each take. But I mean, that's also its own like kind of specialized thing. You have to look for whether someone really understands how to pull focus and what they're doing in between takes to adjust that. But I'll say this, the availability of having a 5D, I think, certainly changed for the good, your ability as a DP or a director to be able to understand filmmaking. I think because you were able to have it, if you had any question or you wanted to rehearse, let's say you wanted to rehearse your film like in your living room with whoever lives in your house, like you could actually do that. You have the camera, you have the lenses, you can see by yourself what that shot looks like. Oh, actually, okay, that's what a 50 mil looks like. That's what a 65 mil looks like. Okay, well, let me make a note. Actually, I don't want this shot to be like that. Whereas, I don't know, when I was much younger, I had like a Canon A1 film camera, 35 camera, but I didn't have all the lenses. So I didn't really know all the lenses because I didn't have anything in my hands that I could hold up. I didn't have a director's viewfinder, so I didn't know my lenses at the beginning. And I think now, I mean, you don't even need those anymore. You can use an app and see what the field of view is for everything. And I think that's something that has opened up a lot more for people to be able to kind of explore what methods they want to be filmmaking.
I mean, I end up having this conversation a lot, both in terms of cinematography, but also in terms of editing, right? Because I mean, like when I was in school, we learned documentary filmmaking on 16 millimeter, right? We would shoot on Bolexes and Atons, and you had to know how to focus. You had to know how to expose with a light meter, and then we would edit on the flatbeds. So you had to make deliberate choices both when you were shooting and when you were editing, and so So now with digital cameras that have peaking and magnification and autofocus, some of that deliberateness is taken out of it, which is freeing in a certain sense, as Martin's talking about. And the other place where we talk about this, as I said, is with the NLEs, with the what was Final Cut when I was coming of age, Final Cut 7, and now is like Premiere and even Avid. The ability to just constantly iterate and not have to. It's a lot of like cutting and undoing and redoing, and you can move at a pace you're almost like your hands get ahead of your head a little bit.
Did I? Oh.
Am I still here? Can you hear me?
Good. Froze out for a sec.
Yeah, so with these new editing, with the NLEs, which have now been around for a while, like your hands can get ahead of your head, so to speak. You can move, but I'm like sort of ambivalent. I mean, I see the virtues in the kind of old analog ways of doing things on film and deliberately making cuts and splicing, and then I see the benefit too of the what could be called the sort of digital revolution. It's like at its best, it's just unlocked new grammars and new ways of telling stories. But I certainly in my own life, like I'm grateful that I had that kind of more deliberate kind of foundation.
Yeah. Well, and I think that kind of sort of begs the answer to the question of like, should I go to film school? It's like, well, film school might teach you a lot of important stuff about the lineage of the filmmaking timeline. It's a relatively young medium, but the thing that's kind of lost now is I don't know how many people are, going to school and learning. Like I went to Arizona State. We were not shooting on 16 mil. I shot on 16 mil as a high schooler at New York Film Academy. Learned way more doing that, and like, because you have to be so deliberate. You have, and just like, and confident too. And I think if you start with something that has all the tools in the world, you don't have that mental acuity for it, I suppose, if that makes any sense. Because I am trying to go back to Martin's point about not sounding like an old fogey and trying to be like, but I think it is like the new tech does not imbibe in you old institutional knowledge that you need to do a young craft such as filmmaking, relatively young. If that makes any sense. I've only had half a cup of coffee today.
No, totally.
Daniel, do you still, you said you're a photographer. What got you into photography?
Yeah, I mean, I always just, took, it's hard to say. It's sort of like a weird kind of affinity that one develops. Like what got me into film? I don't know. I started, like a lot of us, I think, just, I got a video camera when I was 12, and it just seemed like the coolest thing in the world. I was shooting films as a teenager, sort of similar with photography. But yeah, through high school and college, I was shooting, 35 millimeter film. And then I got in college. I shot some medium format. I never had the privilege of doing any darkroom stuff, which I think would, is something on the bucket list. But I think it's just the process. It's like a way, I don't know if it says something about like a kind of like outsiderness about me, or a kind of social anxiety or something. But, it's like there's something about having the camera as this like way to mediate, your interactions in the world. Right. And so I was always somehow more comfortable, like calling myself the photographer than sort of like participating in the events somehow. And that's it's both the camera becomes both a kind of barrier, but also this kind of way of also engaging with the world. Like I find that, I'm of two minds. Like, I travel a fair bit, and I always make a point of bringing a camera. And I'm always of two minds about this kind of stuff, because you go to these wonderful places and you see people who sort of are just like, it seems like they're taking photos and they're not, there's the kind of like cliche about sort of not taking in the scenery around you because you're so obsessed somehow with like documenting it for your social media accounts or something like that. For me, it's actually, I find the camera like forces me to pay attention to things that I never would have. I start to pay attention to the way like the light is hitting the mountains, like around me. And it's just another way of sort of seeing the world. And so I guess I've always just sort of, I've always sort of approached it that way.
Yeah, I actually I can identify with that pretty solidly, because I was not a very social person. But wouldn't you agree that it is that I think there's documenting, like people, the person with the iPad at the concert just filming it. It's like, put it down, it's right there, you're fine. Versus I don't know, highlighting something. When I know in downtown LA, I'm sure this is true in New York. Sometimes the sun is just hitting the buildings in such a beautiful, like kind of perfect way that you start to see frames, and you're not thinking like, oh, what a pretty building. You see these compositions maybe that I don't think maybe a normal person technically has.
Yeah. And it's also like, it's seeing in frames, but it's also like suddenly I'm crawling, I'm on the ground, I'm like, I'm lying in the grass, or I'm climbing up on a rock to shoot down at something. And it's like, that's something I wouldn't do if I didn't have a camera, or if I did it, I would look kind of crazy. But the camera gives me license to sort of like put my body in weird places, Sure. So, yeah.
Right on. Martin, we'll start with you for this double-sided question. How'd you guys, going back to the documentary, how did you guys come up with, not how'd you come up with, but kind of like walk me through how the interaction was with the subjects when you have to show up and set up, the Teratron or whatever it's called, into the interrogation box. And, like the sort of technical, like, all right, we're going to have the phone here and just tell us what you need to do. And like how you approached lighting each person. Was that natural, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say you kind of have to break up the production of this film and the answer to this question to pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Okay.
But yeah, pre-COVID, last fall, when I had kind of started on it, I mean, we're shooting with people who are volunteering to be in it. So some people were happy for us to come into their homes. Some people didn't want us to come into their homes, in which case we do it somewhere in a public place. So you're walking into someone's apartment that you've never seen before. There's no tech scout. And we also had a very minimal amount of stuff. Because the contraption and the computer took a lot of kind of time to set up. It was a thing that Pacha and I had talked about to kind of like minimize the lighting not only just for footprint, but for time's sake. So we kind of embraced whatever people had in their apartment. And, you know, a lot of that would depend on what time of day we were shooting at, when people were off work, or if it was on the weekend, we were in daytime. And so with that, you kind of like we had 1 or 2 LEDs with us. There were small ones. And I brought a bunch of like grip stuff to play around with whatever lighting they had. So, you know, I always tried to travel with diffusion and then duvetine to amend whatever window lighting daylight was coming in through, or throw something on a lamp that we can bring close to their face or something like that. So it was all very kind of like improvised. But then the public places, and Daniel, you shot a fair amount of those public places too. You know, that was also, we found like really great locations, but sometimes they were quite hard to find because, you know, we didn't have like space allocated for us beforehand. So Pacha would have a place in mind, and then we would go and try to figure out where that was. And then we'd immediately kind of like take over, you know, a city. I think, Daniel, you had shot on the sidewalk somewhere, like when Shaq is doing that first one. I think, isn't that on the sidewalk somewhere?
It's sort of in a public walking area, not quite on the sidewalk, but fairly uncontrollable and public for sure. Yeah.
So like coming up with finding a place in public is a bit of a pain in the ass. A lot also because time of day was really difficult. You know, it's hard to shoot these things at magic hour because it takes a long time. And it moves slowly. Some moved quicker than others, but a lot of the times people, they take their time with it. That's where you get the best answers from. And, you know, so like we didn't have exterior grippage around. I think the most grippage we did was Pacha and his mother's interview, because I was like, oh, Pacha's mom's going to be there. We have to like make it the best, you know? And he wanted to shoot it was on Randall's Island, which has like the East River behind them. And I knew that it was just going to be like middle of the day shooting into in the middle of summer, like shooting into this nuclear background. Right. And I was like, Pacha, we have to rent, 12 by and all this and overheads and all that stuff. And he was like, okay. But it was like, we got shut down like 3 times, or it was an attempted shutdown like 3 times by the Randall's Island Park Police or whatever. And so that's basically how we kind of walked into every situation.
And I think too, it's like, the nature of this shooting was like, we set the camera up, and the subjects are sort of free to like, they have their own kind of relationship to the camera, because the camera for them is also this like way to browse their apps. So they're sort of, it's like a lot of documentaries, the camera's almost like this thing that's like invading their space and it's moving around them, and it's sort of like dizzying for subjects. But I think here, like the camera was, I'd like to think it was sort of more, it was like more friendly and approachable. So, and the process of like browsing, I think was, it would take a few minutes of uncomfortable feeling out, but after a few minutes, like subjects really kind of lost themselves in the process of looking for love.
Yeah, I wonder too, like, because that's been a question I've had with a few of the documentarians I've interviewed recently, and that is the effect of the camera on the subject. And I'm wondering if by having the big screen of an app or a website, that's actually something the subject is more used to seeing, so it's a little less aggressive, maybe. You know, instead of the lens, which is kind of a dark hole, you've got just the screen, which is like, oh yeah, I'm used to that.
Yeah, I think that it gives them something to focus on, which, as Daniel said, takes them out of feeling like they're the subject that a camera is being pointed, that a camera is pointing at. And so, I don't know, I think that, yeah, they do have to get over the initial weirdness of like browsing with other people in the room that aren't their friends. But yeah, I think if the activity of them browsing was not part of this, and it was solely Pacho interviewing people about their dating life, I don't think we would have gotten as many intimate kind of stories or feelings from these people, because the act of the browsing thing, I think, you know, alleviates whatever fears they have about being in front of the camera.
Daniel, talk to how being an editor has changed the way that you tend to shoot, because I know for me it's definitely made me a better DP.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly depends on the project. I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've edited has been sort of more kind of verite stuff, in which case I'm always sort of surprised at the lack of sort of like I want to be kind to my cinematographer colleagues, but the lack of sort of verite experience, you know, like it's often kind of a frustrating experience as an editor in a certain kind of like American issue film kind of documentary, which is what I find myself somehow editing a lot, that there's not a kind of, that there's not a kind of, there's just, so what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that when I'm shooting, I'm very aware of like what the needs are of the project and the editing room. So if it's a verite kind of thing, I'm making sure to grab kind of, you know, the standard shots that I need, cutaways. You know, it's like, it's amazing how much the reflex is to just sort of react to what's happening, you know? And I think cinematography so much is about sort of like keeping one eye open and one ear listening to what's going on and about to happen. And, you know, I find like so much of the footage I end up getting is like, as an editor, is like really beautiful, but it's sort of just like whoever's talking, we're just kind of like on them. And there's not a kind of faith in the power of, I mean, both in fiction and documentary, like the shot of the reaction shot can almost do more work than the shot of the person sort of like taking the action. So, but in this case, it's like, this is like a different film in the sense that it's very sort of structured, you know, it's like there's sort of rules to the cinematography, right? We have these kind of locked off extended takes. And we know in the editing that the logic is going to be sort of similar. It's going to be, we're going to meet 20 to 30 of these searchers, and they're going to browse the apps for 2 to 3 minutes. And so as a cinematographer, you start to think, okay, like within that rule bound world, what becomes dramatic, you know, for an editor, right? And suddenly you realize, like, the moment that there's 2 people in the frame instead of just one, like, that's a huge gesture. That's like an interesting evolution that becomes like dramatic in the film. Or when there's action happening in multiple planes of the frame, right? When there's like Martin, some of your stuff in the city where there's people taking selfies, you know, getting married, and then there's jet skis in the background, and there's this sense of the city teeming, which in other documentaries may feel like beautiful B-roll, but in this film take on it, they put sort of independent thoughts in your head about what it's like to search for love in the city. And so, yeah, so like knowing that this is the way that Pacho is going to structure the film, knowing that these small differences take on a kind of magnitude of meaning in the context of this sort of constrained, very deliberate film, I think is important. for the cinematography.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I would add to that I think that once you've been kind of shooting, I think that everybody, especially who's working in documentary, once they've been shooting for a long enough time period, kind of already know how to edit. I don't necessarily think it certainly helps that they've like had to deal with, they've been an editor themselves and had to deal with other people's footage, and then they're like, oh, I get how I should shoot. But I think that once you do it long enough, you kind of already understand how to cut in your head. But what I find like most beneficial is actually having communication with the editor, which I think is the major thing that never happens, is that you shoot the stuff, you dump the footage, and that gets given to the editor, and you never even talk to the editor. And then the editor relays what they want to the director, and sometimes the director doesn't relay that to you, or forgets something, or just so Pacho did on this, like when we were trying to figure out what the city shots should be, like it was an email that everyone was on. You know, Hannah Buck, our editor, was on there telling me like what she wanted, and Pacho was there to weigh in on that or not. And so I think once there became a thing where I was able to talk to Hannah as well, and the three of us could talk about what city shots we needed, it helps you kind of like, it takes the guessing work out of what the editing team wants.
Yeah. What I forgot to ask this because we were talking about the I just keep on wanting to call it the interrogator. What was the shooting package? Was it all like, did you keep that super consistent across the board, or were you just kind of grabbing whatever, or were they cameras you owned?
It was very consistent. It was from day one, from your experimental time, Daniel. You guys were shooting the C300 Mark II, right?
Yeah, Pacho had a C300 Mark II, and then he had the really beautiful Zeiss 28 to 70, right?
To 80, yeah.
28 to 27, yeah. And so that was the lens that, and then I know, Martin, you maybe shot on one or two other lenses for some of the more telephoto city stuff, right?
Yeah, we got so it was the Zeiss compact zoom, the 28 to 80, and then the matching, sibling of it, the 70 to 200, which we were using out when we were shooting stuff in the city. But like, yeah, I mean, it was the C300 Mark II the whole time, and then I forget now because it was a bit fluid, but we even basically shot the same millimeter for every. I mean, it was kind of a range between, what was it like? It's depending if it was a 2-shot or a single, but it was basically between like, let's say 25 and 60 millimeters. And then that changed when we started shooting in COVID because I had to be further back.
Yeah, sure.
But,
and some of that was like overdetermined in the sense that like, we wanted that kind of wider effect. So it felt like we created that sense of like the box that they're leaning into. But also, like, we needed to find a place for the camera where subjects could, like, read their profiles. So they had to be fairly close to the lens as well. So that focal length just was, like, the sort of obvious solution to those two considerations.
But that became a problem when we were, during COVID, we were like, oh, we were self-policing, obviously, because there was no like COVID compliance officer, but it was like, oh, we need to be a bit further away than we have been before. But then like when that happened, it was like, oh shit, we didn't think about this, but people can't read, or some people like they couldn't see the profiles very well or read their names or what the profile said. And it was like, oh, okay. So we maybe inch a little bit closer. But that was kind of an unforeseen thing we couldn't expect.
Yeah. What was the interaction like with the colors? Was there a colorist, or did you just kind of do one of those classic like 709 looks good, do a little adjustment
Daniel
on the exposure? Let's take it. Oh yeah,
Daniel's a whiz.
I did there's a little bit of the like jack of all trades, master of none kind of thing going on, but no,
I'm the same, man. I think I get it.
But no, I mean in this project, like the reason it made sense for me to do the color was because I was also doing the overlay animations, and so that just gave us like the ultimate amount of time to sort of like endlessly tweak them in concert. I think like to figure out a remote workflow with a colorist somewhere, first of all, it's like, how do you even evaluate the color remotely safely? Right. But also like it allowed Martin and obviously Pacho to like workshop the VFX stuff and the color with us. So we could afford to have as many eyes on it up until the very end. And there was a lot of like, you know, like with the overlays, they may have worked, you know, when you're looking at the sort of like low contrast log footage, even with like a little bit of a LUT in Premiere, it might have looked one way, but suddenly when you lift the contrast and bring out some of the colors, you notice that, you know, this part of the frame needs a little burning or dodging to really make the stuff work. And so I just think it was a super practical solution to that finishing process.
Yeah. What was your approach to coloring then? Was there, what were you were there any references that you had, or were you just kind of going with what you thought looked nice?
I mean, more of the latter. I mean, I would say again, like a lot of the film was about, as Martin said, we didn't overlight anything. We wanted to embrace a kind of like naturalness. And so the color process was sort of the same. It was just about bringing out the skin tones and boosting the levels, but it wasn't about baking in like a sort of look into the film. And again, a lot of it was like how it intersected with these overlays, which were, you know, a crucial element for about a third of the film. So yeah, I mean, like all the standard stuff like Rec 709, you know, Gamma. I mean, what was strange about this finishing process was that Sundance premiered online, right? So you're like you like can't really know what how people are gonna watch it, whether they're gonna, you know, be in their beds on an iPhone, which kind of has a different way of like interpreting the Rec 709 2.4 gamma or 2.2 gamma. So that was like a little bit of an experiment, was like figuring out, how do you even QC this thing? Like, how do we know what we're looking at is how people are going to see it? And the answer to that is like, we don't. We just have to kind of take an average. So we have to like, you know, we have to color it in you know, gamma 2.4, Rec 709, which is what you would do for the theater for a DCP, and then we converted the gamma to 2.2, which is just a fancy way of saying we darkened the image, because we know that like computer screens are brighter than theatrical stuff, and then it was like, let's watch the film on an iPad, on an iPhone, on a kind of shitty like smart TV, and on an iMac, and let's make sure across the board nothing is like too dark and nothing is too bright. And I think that's the best you can do in these kinds of circumstances. I'm curious to hear like what others experienced in that process of like finishing for an online premiere.
Yeah. And what did they do with all that money they saved from not having to go QC it in the theater and make a DCP and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, you can't spend it on the wrap party.
Yeah.
By yourself. No, but I mean, when we did coloring, so Daniel did it, and then for the session that I was in on, I went to Pacho's place, and me and him sat next to each other and watched it, and then we kind of gave notes, but we watched it because it was going to be an online premiere. You know, we did something which I've never done before, which was give color notes while watching the film with the windows not blacked out. So, you know, it was like daytime when me and him watched it. And I thought about, before I went over there, I was like, should I bring like some Duvetine to black his windows out? And I was like, no, because we're watching it on iMac because that's where everyone's watching it, on their computer screen. I was like, no, we'll leave the windows. And I think we left his lights on in his apartment and everything. And it was a bit of a weird thing, but yeah, I mean, and it works. But then like, you can do all you want about like trying to get the color to be the best, but then you have this other additional hurdle to get over, which you have no control over, which is the buffering speed of the viewer's internet, right?
Yeah.
Which I watched a few films at Sundance, and they had one of the best. I've watched a couple of online film festivals this year, and all the ones that even had the best like quality, they all still have trouble with dark blacks, and you still see that little patch of squares up here when it's quite dark, and it's like, it sucks because that probably looks like an amazing shot. I'm a fan of like things being really dark, and it just sucks to watch everything become a gray square.
I think it's easy to get like a little bit techie about this stuff, and certainly like the color, like blogosphere is this deep dark hole that you don't want to go too far down. But it is true that like one of the shames is that there's not a kind of standard. There just doesn't seem to be a kind of standard display profile for all these different devices, and so it's really hard to control, as Martin says, like what, a shot that would look great on an iPad looks less so on an iMac. And even within a sort of like family, even within all Apple products, like they all interpret the color information differently. And so like the DCP was like a wonderful solution to this problem in theaters, because it's like, okay, all these like projectors are going to interpret, like red is going to look the same across all these like projectors. And there's not really an equivalent in the the online space. And I think that's like, I think it's like a matter of time before that happens, because like so much of this is shifting for better or for worse to like online premieres and online distribution. And so there just has to be a kind of standard that emerges.
Totally. Well, and I think too, like that used to, oh, go ahead, Martin.
Well, I was just going to say, but the standard is just for us. Like, I just feel more and more that like nobody cares about whether the blacks are blocky and like there's no detail in the white. Like, sure. Nobody cares about any of that. And yeah, I care about it, and I try my best to make everything look as best as possible because I want to view it like that. But I'm also like, yeah, like nobody cares about any of that, and so
yeah, you're totally right. I mean, like it's a kind of the myopics of working on the film, and it's like we watched the premiere on my TV downstairs, in my like the den, and it's got some sort of like horrible like baked in like color profile, so everything was like super saturated. But I watched it with my family and they loved it, and they had nothing to say about whether there was noise in the blacks or so. It's a good reminder, Martin, that it's like it's after the first 3 minutes it's like this, it's the film that matters. It's not it's not like the black levels or the gamma or something.
Sure. Yeah. But I mean, to the other side of that coin is like, I remember the first Sundance screener I watched was out in my living room, and I'm sitting there taking notes to ask questions. And again, this is more of like a DV thing, but I'm sitting there going like, wow, this is really pink. And I'm like going through, I'm like, this is an interesting choice to make everyone so pink. And then I was like, hold on. And I whip out the phone, because it's like a TCL Roku TV, it costs $200. And sure enough, the normal profile is way tweaked. And the like, you have to go down to the dark one, which is technically like the movie version or whatever, and that looked what was showing on my color calibrated laptop. I was like, oh, so this is an issue. And I think too, like the regular viewer kind of just cares about having the best thing. Like I'm sure you've seen people talking about the new iPhone, like, oh, it shoots Dolby Vision, and it's like, you don't know what that means. Like I barely know what that means. I don't know if it actually does. So maybe if we just kind of push TV and display manufacturers to like have a unified thing, like we be the unseen hand that just forces viewers to have the good thing, give them the spoonful of sugar, as it were.
Sure.
But this gets
Martin's
into like
right now is great.
This gets into that thing about God, I forgot her name, the cinematographer who did this push to get Samsung and other TV manufacturers to disable the like the auto shutter mode of TVs.
Was that Todd Vaziri?
I don't know.
Or
I thought it,
Stu?
I don't know. I thought it was
Mashowitz? I
thought it was Reed Moreno or somebody was championing.
Oh, yeah, it could have been her.
But like, yeah, I totally appreciate that because I hate seeing TVs like that. But I see so many TVs like that. It's like, yeah, we can push TV manufacturers to do it, but like, they don't care. I mean, they don't care. They sell TVs to around the world way more people than people like us who care about that. Why would they care about it?
Yeah, maybe you just have like a sports button and a movie button, and we just have to have control over the movie button, because a lot of movie buttons still don't do what we wish they would, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's weird. Like, I remember there was this thing online that I think like around the time that Gus Van Sant, I think this is when I saw it, that Gus Van Sant movie, Paranoid Park, about like the skaters in Portland, that was that Chris Doyle shot it. And I remember after I saw the movie, I watched this thing on YouTube about some Q&A he did, and he was talking about, so I don't know, when was Paranoid Park? But it must have been right around the time when people started watching videos on their phone or something, because he was saying, like, I live in China. Everyone in China watches things on their phone, and nobody here in the US does, but you will be soon. And I remember seeing it and being like, I would never watch a movie on my phone. And I still think that, but like, I've watched so many YouTube videos on my phone. I've watched stuff on my phone all the time. And you go down the street, you're in the subway, you see people watching stuff on their phone. And I was like, oh, it's like the hubris, like I was so arrogant to believe that wouldn't be how our society was going to go. And Chris Doyle was saying it like 10 years ago, you know?
Well, and I think too, like that, just even speaking to the display issue, so to speak, is like, that's going to change how we frame things, right? Like if we know that everything's going to be on a 5-inch screen, although phones are getting bigger, are we going to be just shooting tons of close-ups? Like, how's a wide going to play on a tiny screen?
Yeah, it's true. It won't have the same kind of emotional punch as seeing it big in the theater. I mean, it comes down to, you know, my girlfriend's a graphic designer, and they have the same kinds of questions. Even to take the narrow example of like graphic design in film, it's like the logic was always like, you make the titles like twice as small as you think, because on the big screen titles look bigger than you always guess. And now it's like, do you make a version of the film for mobile and for, I'm glad there are smarter people than me thinking about these questions, because it's a brave new world, and things are changing in front of our eyes. So, and this year was just like crazy. It was like the experiment was accelerated, I feel. But
yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I've certainly started to think about more is like, what do we do about vertical framing? I just started shooting some stuff in this past year, which has been, the mandate was for vertical, for social, but they needed the resolution so that they didn't want to do any cropping. So it was like, okay, we'll flip the camera. But, you know, it's really kind of messes with your head, because you're so unused to shooting humans or framing humans in a vertical way. And so I kept finding myself like, oh my God, I have so much headroom now. And I was like, well, what are we going to do? I started thinking this week, like, what are we going to do with all this headroom? How do we make this headroom interesting in framing? You know, and are we just going to be used to cutting people's shoulders off all the time? Like, how do we get away with, yeah. So I just think it's something that am trying to explore, like this is a new way of viewing things, right? The vertical framing, and how do we make that interesting?
Yeah, I was doing we got to wrap it up here, but I was doing a project with Tom Brady's company where we were interviewing sports fans outside of games. And yeah, it was intended for Instagram Live. And yeah, the second you get two people, like you got to be on an 18 millimeter backed up and then exactly like you said, like how do you get, like a single isn't too terribly difficult necessarily, but yeah, it's a very strange, and like how much belly are you going to be showing? You know,
you got to put them on their shoulders. You know, one's got to sit on top of the other's shoulders, I think is the way to go.
Exactly. Yeah, just playing the backpack game.
Yeah.
So to wrap it up, I've been asking everyone the same two questions. One, what everyday thing has helped you in your life and career as they've intersected? And two, do you have any personal projects that you're interested in pimping?
I guess I would return to I guess it's not totally unrelated to my career, but the benefit of having a camera with you, you know, and not just the iPhone, but continuing to exercise the muscle of like looking through a lens and thinking in terms of how a camera interprets the world. So I've just made it a practice, more so in the past few years, to always have often a 35 millimeter camera with me wherever I go.
Totally. I got an F2, do the exact same thing.
I was going to say, I was like, what's the real thing that has helped me a lot? And I was going to say the having a smartphone. But actually, just thinking about it, the everyday object that is even better than a smartphone that's helped me in my career has been comfortable footwear. I think it's the most important thing you can do when you're either an operator or a cinematographer.
Do you have a recommendation, Martin?
I'm just about to ask, yeah.
Who are you going to plug?
Well, they haven't sponsored me yet, but...
Are they the Australian boot company? Because that's for me.
Blundstone.
Yeah.
I actually just got off of Blundstone, but they were I wore them for many years. They're quite comfortable. I have a favorite model of Adidas that I wear for almost everything. They should sponsor me.
They should. I was about to say we need to get you that Adidas.
Yeah, but maybe they should sponsor a Steadicam operator. I'm not that good. That's more important. Yeah. What are you working on, Daniel?
I'm in the early stages of developing a project with Pacho, actually, about UFO sightings and encounters in New York State. Pacho and I are both from New York, and there's been this kind of like interesting uptick in sightings that I think has a lot to do with like smartphones and social media, but less interested in like the questions that often emerge when you talk about UFOs, which is about like speculating about the nature of UFOs or about government involvement or cover up, and more about sort of like the personal experience and how it transforms the way you experience the world. So, we're still at the beginning, but the idea is to make a film that's about people telling stories and the uncanny feeling that occurs when you see something unidentifiable, and then the challenge of like talking about that thing, with other people, I think is kind of the holy grail for us.
That sounds right up my alley. I'm excited for that. Martin?
Cool.
Well, I have been working on a film of my own, a feature, I guess, which before this pandemic really kind of had some legs, and now we'll see how I have to adjust. I've been trying to figure it out because it was going to take place in like 8 different countries. So that hasn't happened yet. But I've been working on this for about 2 years now, since like doing initial research on it. And this film is basically kind of disparate geographic locations that all speak to one another by means of their geographic circumstances. So they're all somewhat isolated places that share something, even if they're across the globe from one another. There's individual stories and community stories that all share that have some sort of symbiosis because they're from an isolated geography. So I've shot already in some places, and so I've been tinkering with the footage I've shot and been doing a lot of reading and writing for future filming whenever that becomes available.
Cool. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for spending the past hour with me. I really enjoyed that conversation. Hopefully when your guys' projects do come up, we can have you back on and talk about those.
Thank you, Kenny.
All right. Take it easy.
Take care.
Frame and Reference is an Owlbot production. It's produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan, and distributed by Pro Video Coalition. Our theme song is written and performed by Mark Pelly, and the F&R Mapbox logo was designed by Nate Truax of Truax Branding Company. You can read or watch the podcast you've just heard by going to provideocoalition.com or youtube.com/owlbot, respectively. And as always, thanks for listening.